Well, good to see you all today. We're going to go ahead and dive in, I think. If you read the chapter this week, the book, I think this is one of its few flaws, goes probably into too much granular detail and spends too much time on the ins and outs of the Avignon Papacy. And we'll certainly talk about that. That's certainly a big issue, and we'll talk about that today as well. But I think it gets a little too granular and too detailed and misses some other broad sweeps going on in this time period. So today I do want to focus a little bit more on some of those other broad sweeps, and then we'll zero in on that other piece. We're in the middle of a couple of lectures here on the 13 and 1400s. And this is the time, if you remember, the Reformation starts in 1517. So we've got some things, we're kind of at the end of the Middle Ages here. It's the latter stage of the Middle Ages, the late Middle Ages as they're so called. But we've got some things that are starting to trend towards the Reformation. Now, any of these things by themselves are probably not the causation of the Reformation, but as an aggregate, when you start to add and add and add and add and add things together, then there are some things. And some of the things during this time period have absolutely nothing directly to do with the Reformation, and yet lead up to it in some ways. I mean, you know, the Battle of Agincourt in France really has very little to do with it, and yet it has a lot to do with it but we'll talk about a few things like that. So the period we're talking about here, the 13 and 1400s, it also overlaps with a period called the Renaissance. And the Renaissance is one of those periods that historians differ on, and it depends on where you are geographically. In Italy, the Renaissance starts much earlier and peaks earlier, and in the rest of Europe, it's a little bit later thing. But part of this time period overlaps with that. So what I want to do today and next week, we're going to spend 2 weeks on this period here. Today I want to talk about some of the larger socio-political sweeps going on here. And then next week, I'm going to focus more on some of the theological issues that are fermenting in the 13 and 1400s, especially those that will kind of lead into some of the unrest and difficulties in the Reformation. So that's the game plan today. And as I said, the book really focuses in on the Avignon Papacy and the mess that's in. I am going to talk about that, but I'm going to save that for last. I want to talk about 4 other things before that: war, famine, plague, and rising issues of time and money. And then also address the mess in the papacy. So that's my roadmap for today here. So late Middle Ages, war. And probably the biggest war that comes out of this period that we think of, that hits our radar screen at least, is the so-called 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War was not 100 years of war. It actually is about 116 years of war, split into 3 different periods. It was probably one of the closest things. It was purportedly mainly between the French and the English, but at different times they dragged in a whole slew of other European forces, European powers. I mean, you've got the Scots involved on the opposite side from the English. You've got Welsh rebels fighting against the Welsh that are loyal to the King of England on 2 different sides. You've got the French split. There are French factions fighting on each side. You're dragging the Italians in on both sides. Italy is not a country yet, won't be for centuries. Spain is not a country yet, but Italian kingdoms and Spanish kingdoms are certainly involved. And even Bohemia gets involved, way off in what we would call the Czech Republic now, Czechoslovakia. Bohemia is tied up in this too. So it's not quite in Portugal as well. So it's not quite a world war in the sense that the 20th century conflicts were, but a lot of powers are being drug in to these conflicts over this period. And the 2 biggest touchstones for us, when we say 100 Years' War, what probably culturally hits for us is Shakespeare's play Henry V, solidly set in the middle of the 100 Years' War, and St. Joan of Arc. And so I'll just mention both of them briefly here. Henry V, if you know Henry V, you may have seen it on stage, but the Laurence Olivier movie and the Kenneth Branagh movie are the 2 windows that I have come to mind most commonly with that. If you remember Henry V, part of the climax of the play is the historical event, the Battle of Agincourt. Henry actually it's not the English fighting the French. It's actually, we don't want to dive into the complexities of English-French relationships, but the English king was also a vassal of the King of France for all this time. And remember, William the Conqueror was Norman French, conquered England. So he's still, they're still under the King of France on their French side of their territories, and their sovereign on the English Channel, other side of the English Channel. It makes things complicated. And there was a dynastic succession issue with France, and the kings of England could make a good claim that they should be the new King of France. And so that's what this part of the 100 Years' War is about. So it's not so much as England versus France, but whether the English king should also be the French king, or whether a different house should rule France. 116 years over that. But part of what is important for us theologically is a very lopsided battle. There are actually several lopsided battles, Crécy and Poitiers, which are earlier, but Agincourt is the one we know about most because of Henry V. 6,000 French knights, especially, plus some other French soldiers dead, and fewer than 600, maybe fewer than 100, depends on your historian and your records, English dead. So extremely lopsided. If you remember this, Welsh longbowmen send up flurries of arrows that just wipe out the knights in armor. Before this, in the centuries before this, more knights would die in jousting than they would on the battlefield. It was much more dangerous to be a knight playing games, playing your rodeo games, your jousting games, than it was to be on the battlefield. You were pretty safe. Now, some people have power. It's not the wealthy nobles at the top, hint, 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 who have the supreme power on the battlefield. You get a bunch of serfs out there with good bows and arrows. They can take down a wealthy, rich, powerful, heavily armored knight. And so this is part of what's going to be rising in these centuries are these popular movements. The people, make a parallel to the church. Should the clergy maybe not be at the top of the pyramid? Should the people maybe have some more voice? So you can see where some of this might have an influence on the Reformation later on. So don't want to dive too much deeper into that. I do want to mention, though, Joan of Arc. She is a Roman Catholic saint. I don't think she's on the Episcopal calendar, is she, Jimmy? I don't think so. And she wasn't a Roman Catholic saint until fairly recently, only about 102 years ago. 1920. But if you remember the story, Joan of Arc was a young peasant girl. She claimed, French peasant girl, she claimed to have had visions of St. Michael the Archangel and St. Catherine and a couple others. And she ended up a peasant girl leading one of the French factions in defense of one of the claimants to the French throne. Now let's think about that for a second. A peasant leading knights into battle. Again, we've got this flip here of the regular feudal order. Is that so important with Joan of Arc in particular, and a few battles she fought in? Not really, but does it signal larger trends and changes? You better believe it. Interesting. And we think of the English burning her as actually the Burgundians, who were also French, who captured her. They were English allies. They tried Joan for heresy. And they also tried her for cross-dressing, which was tied into heresy, dressing as a man. And she was executed by burning at the stake in 1431. The Catholic Church did retry her posthumously a quarter century later, and she was exonerated. And then much, much later, she became so popular in France, eventually she became canonized as a Roman Catholic saint. So she's another window, not so important in and of herself, but the larger trends of this time period. People, power, populism starting to rise up, a little more important than the structure at the top, perhaps. So that certainly will play into later developments. So snapshots that gives us into the larger themes. So during this time, war is becoming much more brutal. It's not so gallant, it's not so romantic anymore. The knight charging off to defend his lady fair. Well, knights are sitting dead on the battlefield with arrows through their armor. It's not quite the fun it was earlier on. Also, the commoners are starting to use, you've got longbows, you've got early gunpowder developing. You've also got mercenary armies. Instead of the system where lords would bring their troops, you started to hire troops. Again, people power becomes more important. And also groupings of people, nation states are starting to form and coalesce. That will also be important later in the Reformation. Reformation will be not so much about individual people in some ways, but a patchwork of political entities choosing up one side, Protestant over Catholic. Okay, so far so good. All right, another huge issue in the late Middle Ages, especially the 1300s, was famine. It was a period of really, really tough. They had some climate change. It was warm and wet, which actually greatly caused crops to rot in the field, which is a weird kind of famine. We think in this part of the world of drought as being the big enemy, not wet. But if it's too wet, it can be bad too. Those are the famines in Northern Europe, the dates. There are a slew of them. That's a bunch that happens. And the one from 1315 to 1317 is termed the Great Famine. 2.5 years elapsed. They usually have 2 harvests a year, a spring harvest from the winter crops, and then a fall harvest as well. And with the Great Famine, they went 2.5 years between normal levels of harvests. And they ate a lot of their seed. And it really took a long while, mid 13, it took almost a decade to kind of recover normality, to build up enough seed and things like that. The numbers are, again, hard to pin down, but it looks like about 1/10 of the population of southern England and France died of hunger and starvation. There are all kinds of stories of cannibalism and things like that. Dogs and horses populations plummeted. So it was a tough time period there. And so that, war, famine, those are signs of the apocalypse in the book of Revelation, interestingly. And so people start to think in those terms as well. And another sign of the apocalypse that hit the Middle Ages, late Middle Ages, was plague, especially the big Black Death, or the bubonic plague, or simply just called the plague. From 1346 to 1353, this disease swept through Asia and North Africa and eventually into Europe. And just for them, think of it, we've been through a plague of sorts, but nothing of this kind of degree. Plus we have some, we have pretty early on, it's a virus, okay? It's this virus. How do we fight it? Well, let's take pieces of it and try, we have some kind of conceptual framework to try to understand the disease. They didn't have that in the 1300s. So there were all kinds of bizarre thoughts about what caused it. Well, actually, the best theories that we have is probably bacterial infection, probably carried by fleas on rodents. And that was, but nobody knew to kill the rats and stop the fleas and all that. And there was some transmission by air too, most likely. But there were all kinds of questions. Maybe it's the mist. Maybe it's the swampy miasma coming off the wetlands. Maybe Jews are poisoning the wells. They were scapegoating that way. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. Maybe it's a direct divine punishment. Yeah, go ahead, Gordon.
It seems like I read in the past that at this time they dispose of their bodily functions by pouring it into the gutter of the street. There was no sewer system.
Right.
And so you walked around town and there was just, everything in the gutters. And so that again was contributing to possibly to some of this. Certainly. I mean, yeah, medieval cities would not be a place you'd want to walk through barefoot. And they did, they had some shoes that they would wear. It wasn't just sandals for the most part, except for the Franciscan weirdo monks and things. But yeah, nasty. So that doesn't help. And the Romans had, a modicum of sanitation. They built, they had sewer system and things, but yeah, that was out the window by
the Middle Ages. Yeah, so nasty time. The death rate, and this is what is shocking to us. The death rate may have been as much as a half. One of every two people. Count it. That's a high estimate. 60% is actually the highest estimate. The low end of that estimate is still 25%, a quarter. That's still a huge count. 1, 2, 3 dead. 1, 2, 3 dead. 1, 2, 3 dead. If you imagine, we at St. Paul's, COVID has been about 1/3%. And that's what's hit us. We've lost one member to death from COVID out of several hundred folks. But imagine if we had lost 100 or 150 of our, that would just be shocking. I've had family members get sick of COVID, but nobody's died of COVID in my family, thankfully. So just imagine the mindset of losing that kind of slice of the population. And even if it is just a quarter of the population, that's still shockingly huge slice. So very, very tough plague those years. And there's some scholars that estimate that the population of Europe didn't get back to where it was in 1300 until 1500, or some even say 1600. That it took that long, that Europe dove down in population, and it took that long to recover. And there are other estimates. I was reading one study that was tracking average lifespans of the English royal family, who are going to be doing better than the average bear. And their average lifespan during that time dropped from the mid-30s to about 17. So that's pretty bad. That's pretty bad. Oh, also, I forgot to say the Great Famine. That was one of the first indicators of the Great Famine. The king pulled into town. One of the kings pulled into town of England and couldn't get a meal. So they knew things were bad. When the king can't eat, things are bad. When the royal family is dropping dead as well as everybody else, things are bad. As you might imagine, now we've had quite a bit of stuff happen because of COVID. I mean, we've had, the stock market fell and then it's come back up and now it's falling again. And we've had some inflation coming afterwards, fairly significant this year. We've also had employment issues, but imagine if we had lost a quarter of the workforce, what that might do to our economy. And sure enough, those were issues then. Some people made out very well. Fewer workers, higher wages. I mean, we see some of that in our economy here. Some people, depending on what business you're in, didn't make a profit. If you're a producer of something that needs a large market that's very marginal, like cloth making, you need to sell a lot of cloth to break even. And if not as many people are needing to be clothed, you might not be in good shape. If you're relying on farming a lot of land and you can't get a lot of workers, you might not be in good shape. So some profited greatly and some suffered economically because of it. There was also rampant inflation at the time. And there was some very, economics is not really invented yet as we would understand it, but there were some places that would try to freeze wages. Peasants and workers in the field can't ask for any more money. You're frozen out. That was not universal, but that was kind of some localized experiments in that. Some people tried to move to cities to get better jobs, and there were some local laws passed in some places to say you couldn't move. You had to stay where you were. So, early economic things going on because of that. Also, in the church, a lot of clergy dropped dead. There was a huge clergy shortage, and their response was to kind of crank up the clergy making machine and spew out as many more as we can. And they perhaps were not as discerning as they could have been. And the people going into the ministry, of course, there were some undoubtedly good priests that were serving then, good clergy, but there were a lot of bummers during this time period as well that kind of got cranked out post-plague. One of the ways, especially in England, that is weird to us, you got money for being the head priest of the church, and if you were the head priest of 2 churches, you got the money. If you're the head priest of 3 churches, you got the money for 3 churches. collected the offerings. And then you might start hiring some young priests to go out and actually be there. You might not even be in your church, but if you can imagine, so you can imagine some people with those kind of motives seize that opportunity. And yeah, Jimmy, go ahead.
And bishops started doing this.
And bishops started doing the same thing. Yes, yes. And so you start amassing territory for money, which is, I'm gonna be the priest of 7 churches. Well, I can't take care of 7 flocks, but I'll find 6 goobers that can do it to help me out, and I'll pay them very poorly, and I'll rake in the wealth. Okay, so there are a lot of those kind of abuses started up then. Again, not a direct cause of the Reformation, but those kinds of trends are part of the seeds of the Reformation here. All right, so war, famine, plague, those are 3 pretty serious things. And there were some, a number of spiritual, how do we deal with this? What's the spiritual lesson for all this? Well, one spiritual reaction is very straightforward. We have sinned, and God is sending war, famine, and plague to punish us. God has abandoned us or is punishing us, so it's time for us to repent. And so you had this kind of thing here. I know that's from Monty Python, and that's hitting themselves in the head with the boards. But they're not just making that up. They're basing it on some real groups. There's a group called the Flagellance that arose in Europe, and they started wandering the countryside in processions, whipping themselves. If you notice, they've got banners and crosses they're following there, but then the guys behind have whips in their hands, and they are beating themselves. This is a sign, trying to repent. That great Bergman film, The Seventh Seal, shows some flagellance during this time period, time of the Black Death. And so that was one response spiritually. We have sinned. We need to do some serious repenting. And that's pretty serious if you're going to walk around beating yourself with a whip to try to gain God's favor. Now, is that how God's grace works? Well, the Reformation might have some interesting insights into that later on, but that's one reaction spiritually. Another reaction, someone else has sinned, and that's why this has happened. And God is punishing all of us or has abandoned us because of them, so let's get them. And one group that got scapegoated was the Jewish population, heavily scapegoated. All kinds of persecution of Jewish folks during this time period. They're the ones that sometimes causing it directly, or sometimes God is doing it because of them, because we allow them in our midst. So that happened. Also, other groups said, well, it really is those rotten SOBs at the top of the pyramid. They are behaving poorly, and we're paying the price. And so some pointed their fingers at kings or the nobility, some pointed their fingers at bishops or popes or other clergy. So that's a response that is also bubbling up at this time. And that will certainly also be one of those things that has a trajectory towards the Reformation later on. Another response, well, eat, drink, and be merry, tomorrow we'll die, so let's party hardy today. One of the big literary works out of this time period was Boccaccio's Decameron. It was written during the plague itself. It's about people, nobility seeking refuge in a country manor, and to entertain themselves, they tell all these love stories. Some of them are very noble, and some are very crude, very body love erotic stories. But let's party. Let's focus in on the pleasures of the flesh, food, wine, sex. Because life is short, we may as well enjoy ourselves. We Americans can't understand any kind of dynamic like that. I mean, that's so far off our radar screen. Not. Okay, so that is a reaction here. Another reaction that some had: this religion stuff's a crock. This God stuff is a crock. Now, nobody at this point was. We have to deal with heavy agnosticism and heavy atheism in our culture. That's the rising, most quickest growing religion in our culture is agnosticism/atheism. That's not what they're doing, but they're seeing God as more distant or more ineffectual. Maybe we're not going to deny the existence of God, but we certainly are understanding the rules, how God works differently. God is not. We're praying and God's not doing squat for us. So maybe God's distant. And later, the deist movement in the 1700s will come to later. God creates the universe and then steps back, lets it go, and we're kind of on our own. Some seeds of that are being planted during this time period as well. God's not changing the weather. God's not stopping the pandemics. God, and some even questioning, is God powerful enough to do that? Maybe God is weaker than we thought he is. So at this point, we're not denying that there's a God, but we're questioning the nature of God. So that's a piece of it. A little bit related, some talked about, maybe it's not God punishing us after all. Maybe just sometimes these bad things happen. And that's certainly something we 21st century people can wrap our minds around a little bit better. But that was something that really started bubbling up more. There had been an idea, Fortuna was a Roman goddess, and there's some kind of rediscovery of fortune and fate in the literature. Here's a medieval painting of fate, medieval manuscript illustration. It shows fortune in the middle spinning the wheel, and sometimes the wheel takes you up, sometimes the wheel takes you down. Wheel of fortune, not about letters and money, but about rising tides of your own fortune and fame and falling. And it starts over here on the left, and the guy saying, "I shall reign." At the top, he says, "I reign." As he's falling, he says, "I have reigned." And at the bottom, he says, "I have no kingdom, I have no realm." So just depending on where you are, or maybe you have no kingdom, maybe you start a different place in the wheel, and you're going to reign. Maybe you can. So the idea that maybe it's random, roll the dice. Sometimes the dice come up 1-1, sometimes they come up 6-6, sometimes they come up 3 and 4. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. So that's starting to ferment and bubble a little bit. Remembering during this time, let's see, even during the 1700s, when Ben Franklin invented the lightning rod, there was pushback from some Christians that we can't put a lightning rod on our house because that will stop God from punishing people. The lightning strike on your house is God's direct punishment. That God is that hands-on, that the forces of nature are not operating according to their own laws, but God is directly causing everything that happens. Now, is God responsible for everything that happens? I would say you better believe it. But does God force a lightning bolt to hit here and not here? Jesus says God's sun shines on the righteous and the unrighteous. God allows evil to flourish. And anyway, so even hundreds of years later, the idea that does God create every possible little thing that befalls you, or sometimes do bad things just happen? Do viruses mutate? Do winds blow and sometimes get concentrated in tornadoes or hurricanes? And if you're in the path of them, you're going to be in trouble. Maybe God is not sending the hurricane to destroy you because you've been wicked, but just because he's allowing creation that freedom. So those kinds of ideas are starting up here as well. And there was another reaction here, and this reaction could apply to a lot of those other reactions, whether 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5. Use this as a reminder that you are mortal. Jesus talks about that. Life is short. Don't say you've stored up treasure and you can rest and relax. You may die that night. So remember that you are mortal. And so there are a couple things that really arise during this time. The dance macabre started to be a theme in art. The dance of death. The death is coming and dancing with everybody. If you look, death is there dancing with kings and queens, with cardinals and bishops, with merchants, with a beggar that has a wooden leg, and with a baby coming out of his cradle. The death is, all of us, mortality rate is still 100% on this earth. And for some of you, it may be sooner than others. So remember that. Don't forget about that part of your reality. And so they also have the expression memento mori. Have a remembrance that you're going to die. One day you got three lovely young ladies, and the next day they're dead. So take that as a remembrance that you're going to die. I love this carving. This is kind of graphic, but it's a statue on one side, this lady, very, very pleasant, well-to-do. On the other side, it's her as a skeleton with worms and, for some reason, lizards or salamanders. I'm not sure why salamanders are eating her up, but she's got snakes or worms crawling in her neck and stuff. So remember, etchy finum, I guess I'm finished. I'm at the end. I'm done. So remember that you're going to die. Use this death, plague, famine, war as remembrance that you are mortal, and get your act together because of that. Yeah, Jimmy, go ahead.
They actually make some rosaries with skulls on it. They still do sometimes. The memento mori.
Memento mori says on
Rosaries,
some.
they are regular rosaries, those skulls, where some of the beads are just not for any weird grim stuff, but just to remembrance that you're going to die.
Well, and every year we have an observance on Ash Wednesday. In the Episcopal Church and other liturgical churches, we make a sign of the cross and ashes and remember that you're dust, and the dust you shall return. Remember that you are mortal. We think of death as an aberration. We think of sickness as kind of, we Americans, for whatever reason, I preached on this before, think things are going well, then we get upset when they don't. Most cultures in the history of the world think things are going to be bad, and then if they happen to be good, yay. We're just the opposite. We are kind of spoiled in some ways. We've been so fortunate to live in this wonderful country and have this kind of the blessings that we have, that we expect things are always going to be good, and when they're not, it throws us for a loop. They're dealing with something at a different level here. Remember that you're going to die. Remember that you're dust. Okay, real quick, we don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but I just wanted to mention changes in time and mind. We're starting to have growth of a merchant class. Instead of nobles at the top and serfs at the bottom, we're starting to have that middle class develop. And some of them, especially after the plague, got very wealthy. You had some commoners, merchants, who got far more wealthy than the dukes and the earls and the lords were, because got rise of great households in Italy, the Medici family, merchants. So that's starting to happen. There's starting also to be a rise in urbanization. If we are going to start having a mercantile economy, then we're going to be able to concentrate in the city and build things and create things and craft things. And we don't need to have everybody out on the farm. And so that's also, there were cities all the way through this period, but the cities were smaller and the cities were fewer, and the percentage of the population was less. We're starting to see more urbanization during this time. Because of that, in medieval Europe before the late Middle Ages, time was always measured by the sun. Okay, it's dawn. Even the Bible, the New Testament talks about this. The Romans would talk about, the first hour, and then the third hour, mid-morning, and then the sixth hour, and then the ninth hour, what we say 3 in the afternoon or so, and then the 12th hour. And during the hours might differ in length based on the time of year, whether there's a long day or a short day, but you kind of guess what time it is based on the sun. Also, you guess what time it is based on when it's time to plant, those kinds of things. Also, they relied heavily on their calendar of church festivals. How do you know when it's time to plant? Well, it's St. Michael's Day. Maybe we need to make sure to get everything in the ground by St. Michael's Day. Also, the day itself. I hear the bell going off. The monks or the priests are praying morning prayer. So that's time for us to get up and do things. Oh, it's the bells are ringing in the evening. It's evening time. And it's based on the church services going on. The churches are ringing bells that can be heard in the villages. That's starting to change. In the cities, there's an increasing sense that your time is a commodity, that the time you spend working turns into money. Kind of a novel idea, not for us, but for them. Also, they had a new invention, and they started sprouting up in lots of places. Clocks, public clocks. They're still so big and bulky, most individuals couldn't afford a clock because you needed lots of mechanisms and stuff. but buildings would often have them in your town, and it was often a secular building, a merchant's building or a civic building that would have a clock. And later, some churches also would build some clocks too, but the clocks started out as more of a secular feature. And so time is not dependent on when the church rings its bells. Time is not dependent on what the services are for the day. Time is dependent on what that machine says time is. It's not even what the sun says, it's what that machine says time is. And so let's organize our lives accordingly. And you hear about those factory towns in the 19th century that relied on the steam whistle. Everybody listened for the factory steam whistle to know what to do during the day. We're getting some early glimmers of that. Also, as we're starting to get this rising merchant class, and some of them are starting to get quite wealthy, interestingly, some of them were very worried about their salvation. They'd read in the Bible about it's easier for a rich man to go through, a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Money. What do I do with my money? God's going to get me for being rich. So I need to do something about that. And so one of the ways they would try to get around that, to buy, quote unquote, their salvation, they would endow churches and monasteries in their wills or during their lives. And they would also, some of them, would endow priests to pray for them in perpetuity, to offer services every day on their behalf. Just make sure you get God on your side. And also they look to start carrying a little more organized way for the poor. You always give alms to beggars. There are always poor with you, as Jesus says. But they started to look for ways of caring for the poor with what we would call maybe foundations, organizing your money in a certain way, part of your money to help with the poor. Also during this time, and this is going to be hugely important in the Reformation, the idea of purgatory really blossomed. Purgatory really didn't hit the radar screen until the 1100s. Roman Catholics didn't make it official until the 1200s. But in the 1300s and 1400s, it really started to gain some traction. The idea of purgatory was if you're not good enough to quite get into heaven because of your sins, maybe God allows an intermediate state to work off your sins, to purgate yourself, to cleanse yourself. We'll talk more about this in a couple of weeks, or next week. I'll talk more about it as well. And Luther in the Reformation pushes heavily back against that. But that also is starting to be an idea that really is bubbling up. Maybe if we give enough money, maybe that'll shorten our time in purgatory. Maybe that's a way we can use our funds to save us, because our money puts us in danger. So how can we use our money to bring us salvation? And it gets really corrupt later on, and we'll talk about sale of indulgences and all that later on. So that's coming. Real quick, your book does go into granular detail on this, too much, but if you really want the ins and outs, the mess in the papacy during this time. All right, so here's the shorter form of this instead of the granular version in the textbook. So about 1300-ish, the Pope and the French king got tangled up with each other. There were a bunch of causes, but it really devolved to money, power, and authority. The Pope was in a position eventually in the fight that he was about to excommunicate the French king and put the entire country of France under interdict. France then wasn't France now, it's a smaller chunk of France. But interdict means no communion, no baptism, no sacraments, no funerals in your country, in your realm, until you straighten up, king. It was meant to put pressure on the kings from below as well as from above. Friends of the French king broke into the papal palace in Italy, beat the snot out of the Pope, kind of kept him under house arrest, and he died later, a fairly short time later, of the wounds of a broken heart. Who knows? But okay, so that's pretty bad. That's pretty bad. There's another papacy, fairly short, but after that papacy, a French bishop and friend of the king was elected Pope with heavy influence politically from the French king. He really got in there and influenced this election. And that particular French Pope, friend of the King of France, decided that Rome's kind of a nasty place. Let's move the operation to France. They moved to a couple places. Eventually, it landed in the southern French city of Avignon. And so from 1309 to 1376, the Roman Catholic Church was headquartered in southern France. Now, those who are more neutral about it call this the Avignon Papacy. Those on the Roman Catholic side who are angry about it, especially the Italians, call it the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. Just like the Jewish people were taken off into exile in Babylon, the papacy was carried away from our beloved Italy, and it was stuck in France. Okay, so depends on where you are on the spectrum, but those are titles you hear. During this time, this is the Papal Palace in Avignon, huge complex that was built. And during this time, the Roman Catholic Church became much more like what we would consider the modern Roman Catholic Church to be, much more bureaucratic, much more centralized. Before, there's always been a pope, always been some cardinals, but things started to hub more from the pope's central office than they did previously. So that happened during this time period. Also, as they were appointing cardinals, they didn't appoint nearly as many Italians. The French cardinals appointed during this time period outnumbered the Italians 6-1, and they were small, like a 20th of the cardinals were non-Italian, but a small fraction. But the French really were calling the shots during this time period. 1376, the seventh French pope decided time to go back to Rome. That was a historical place. 2 years later, he died, and the cardinals elected an Italian, the first Italian for most of that century. And eventually, that Italian pope really upset the French cardinals. And so the French said, he's not the real pope. Let's elect our pope. And so this began several decades of what are called the anti-popes. The French cardinals had their line of popes, and the Italians had their line of popes. You can make a strong argument the Italian line is a legitimate line, the French line is illegitimate, but the French at the time would claim that. But okay, several decades of that going on. That's a mess. Who's the pope? Well, we got two of them. Who's in charge of the church? Well, we got two claimants here. 1409, some cardinals met. They tried to depose both popes and decided to elect a new one. But the other two popes refused to step down. The mess becomes worse. Instead of two popes, you now got three popes for not quite a decade, but for a number of years here. So things are that's a mess. Your house is not in order when you've got that kind of division within your church. So eventually there was a council meeting in Constance. We'll talk about it next week too, because of John Hus. He also appeared at that council. That's another story. They got the most legitimate pope to abdicate. We'll make you a cardinal. Retire back to being a cardinal. Okay, I'll do that. This pope stuff's for the birds. Sure, I'll do that. And they tried to get the other two guys to abdicate. They wouldn't, so they deposed him. One of them kind of went along with deposition. One didn't, hid out in Spain and claimed to be his successors for another couple of decades, claimed to be the real popes. But by and large, we were back down to one pope. They elected a deacon to be pope named Martin. They ordained him priest a couple of days later. They ordained him bishop the next day. That did happen. Becket was a deacon when he was made Archbishop of Canterbury. So had to be a priest first and then a bishop. So 1417, we have one pope again, more or less. So that's about a century before the Reformation. But think of the seeds that this plants. The church is not just Christ's beloved bride on earth. It's also this messy, nasty human institution with politics heavily tangled up in it. That also will plant some seeds for the Reformation. All that discord. It's going to be a century until the Reformation springs up, but this is paving the way in some ways there. All right, so that's a number of nasty things today. War, famine, plague. Time and money is not so nasty, at least not for Americans. We kind of like those things. But the mess in the papacy, nasty, nasty stuff. So next week, I want to look at some of the theological issues of this same time period, 1300s, and even more the 1400s, that lead up to the Reformation, because there are going to be some intellectual things that start to plant themselves, some at a high academic level, and a lot in the way that people regarded things as well. Some popular devotions and things like that arose, popular theology. So that was a lot of stuff there. I'll stop there. Any thoughts or questions here, y'all? If you're gonna pick a low point in the papacy, this is probably it.
Was it in the 70s where a bishop in France said all these reforms are turning us Protestant and kind of played a little rival?
There's a bunch of them.
There are from time to time these groups within the Roman Catholic Church that claim to be the true Roman Catholic Church. The singer Sinead O'Connor got involved with one of those groups. She actually, I don't know if she still is.
She's a Muslim now.
She's Muslim now, but she was actually ordained a female priest from one of these Catholic splinter groups at one point. She rips up the Pope's picture on Saturday Night Live, and then she becomes a priest a decade later of a splinter Roman Catholic. Ironic, but yeah. So there are these groups that arise from time to time. That
And the title for those groups is sede vacantis, which means that the sede vacante is when the bishop is no longer in their seat, in their diocesan seat. So they say the Vatican is a vacant seat because there is no true pope anymore. So,
because of sin,
yeah.
the
Usually
seat
it's
is
Vatican.
empty. So we can do what we need
It's
to
like
do.
we're in communion with something called the old.
So the old Catholic churches of Germany,
Utrecht.
Utrecht, yeah, okay.
That's from Vatican I though.
That's from the
1800s.
1870s.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's a group we're in communion with one of them. We're in communion with a number of churches. The Martama Church of India, we're in full communion with as well. Other questions here?
I remember there was a congregation somewhere, I think it was on East 34th Street or somewhere, where they did the mass in Latin.
Yeah. They're saying
I really would not.
That's also very controversial in the Roman Catholic Church right now. Some of the old hardliners really want the Latin Mass, and just like we have hardliners that want the old Elizabethan language, like we do at 8 o'clock. Not the modern language, more modern language we do at 10:30.
When my dad was attended, I think Evensong at St. Paul's in London once, and he said there was a Roman Catholic lady sitting behind him, and the choir was singing something in Latin, and he heard her tell her friend, "Yeah, the Pope won't let us use Latin. The Anglicans are using it."
They can, but we can't. I did a funeral several years ago. There's a Roman Catholic lady here, and it was a right one funeral. So the Lord be with you and with thy spirit, which is a better translation than "and also with you," which is what the Roman Catholics were using. And so she was very excited because she liked that better. That was close to the old Catholic response. Now they've switched as well. And also your spirit
and with your
and with your spirit is their name. Yeah, that's a more literal translation of the old liturgical formula. All right, y'all. Next week, some more theology leading up to the Reformation. And then 2 weeks, we'll have Luther nailing theses to the door and the fur flying in Western Europe. Okay, good deal, y'all. See you.